Welcome back to this online brown bag series on follies in fragile states. My name is Ian Quick, and I hope you've watched at least a few of the previous videos, because we are now going to jump into the questions raised by the experience in the Congo. I'm going to come at that from two wildly different perspectives, so bear with me here. This is the Challenger shuttle. It exploded 73 seconds after launching in 1986. Due to a technical fault. And I put it up here because it is one of the most studied cases in history of how organizations make decisions. Not because the fault and the failure couldn't be predicted, but for precisely the opposite reason. All the necessary data was there, and nonetheless the launch went ahead. So this poses an interesting problem. And when you read through all of the formal inquests and academic studies, what's striking is the disconnect between different perspectives. The engineer who is most directly involved with the faulty components said that we lay down on the launch pad to stop the Challenger from going ahead. But the reality is that things weren't seen this way by managers or even by other engineers. The problem, the alarm that this engineer identified just did not translate into organizational urgency. The fact that the component was underperforming became normalized. It just became a fact in the background. So the launch went ahead and people died. And this is the first question really that I want to ask about stabilization in the DRC. The data were there. Everything that I'm presenting is just a reparsing, a reorganization of already available information. And yet we went ahead for 5-6 years until a crisis struck, until the fall of Goma surfaced the problem and made us finally pay attention to things that were always already there. So how do we keep our sense of urgency? How do we avoid normalizing underperformance and signs of failure as something that is acceptable and present in the background? From here back 1500 years, 526, this is a picture from a collection of alchemical receipts, and the monks that you're looking at here are in the process of brewing up a probably quite useless remedy, and we see the tools of the trade scattered around them. And I'm stealing here from the analyst and author Graham Smith, who wrote on Afghanistan that, quote, "Our techniques resemble the early days of medicine, when the human body was poorly understood, and doctors prescribed bloodletting or drilled into skulls to treat madness." Now, I like this analogy. Just like those early doctors, we do not have the option to do nothing. The scale of human suffering in the DRC, Syria, and Central African Republic doesn't permit us to do nothing. Yet we have to admit at the same time that what we're doing is really very new. The last 20 years or so is a slender base of experience to draw on. So the second question I want to pose is, how do we step back and update this very rudimentary science to reflect the experience that we've accrued in the DRC before we rush off and make the same mistakes in Libya, in Yemen, in whatever new crisis crosses the desk of the UN or other organizations? And I want to offer a few suggestions in this regard. The first is on how we identify the problem that we want to solve. We are not short of elaborate theories of how countries and how governments work. Here we're looking at something from the OECD, Institute for State Effectiveness. This is the Bertelsmann Transformation Index, this peculiar amoeba-looking thing. And these are essentially models of the physiology of a high-functioning government, the different systems that make it work and be sustainable. And they're conceptually coherent. But what the Congo case shows us so clearly is that there is no diagnostic approach linked to this. We saw symptoms and we just asserted that it was due to the breakdown of the kinds of systems you see depicted on this page. What we didn't do is take a careful look at the psychology and the interests that lay behind violence. We didn't do much careful historical analysis of these specific parts of the country that we were dealing with. What's worse, we ignored answers. We ignored data that didn't fit with our elaborate conceptual schemes that you're looking at. We denigrated them as traditional systems that didn't fit into our schematic and as backward ways of doing things that we would somehow leapfrog into the modern world. So this is point one. Start with the patient experience and what they're telling you about what matters. For point two, I'm going to make a rare reference to my country of origin, which is Australia. This is a painting of Ned Kelly, who was a murderer and a thief in the 19th century, but who still remains quite iconic. And that's because he represented a struggle between precisely the kind of state authority model that I've been talking about so much in this series, and a very fractious rural population. Contemporary newspapers during the 19th century used to talk exactly about a battle for the bush, with some exaggeration, but perhaps not too outrageous. And the broader point here is that any big country has this frontier mythology. American westerns, most famously, the Cossacks in Russia, so-called hill people in China, India, Vietnam. And that outlaw mythology is a way of articulating the frictions that inevitably occurred as governments sought to play a larger and larger role. It was a long time before police or land tenure or any robust social welfare system really took hold in remote areas. And it was a contested process, and in many cases remains a contested process every step of the way. It's unclear why we assume that we can have a totally different trajectory to this in the DRC, which sits at the upper end of difficulty geographically and at the absolute lower end of resources. So this is point two. Our reference points for what good looks like have to look a lot more like Nigeria or Pakistan and a lot less like Switzerland. The former states have violence and regional inequities and a whole raft of problems, but we don't label them failed states. And they are grotesquely understudied in comparison to those very elaborate and frankly quite Eurocentric models that you saw a few slides ago. In short, we must source a lot more of our expertise and a lot more of our experts from countries with real lived experience of balancing these problems of difficult geography and limited resources. So that's where I'll end for now. I can't wrap up, obviously, without plugging the book. If you liked any part of this video series, you will enjoy it. It is packed full of very human stories that have a lot more room to breathe on the page than they can possibly have in short videos on the internet. Otherwise, please drop by the website or find me on social media. Thank you.